The theater was supposed to be a place of magic, a place where the ordinary dissolved into wonder, where velvet curtains and warm lights transformed fear into applause. But on this particular night in Las Vegas, inside the historic Sands Hotel showroom, magic was the last thing anyone felt. The air was tense, heavy with cigarette smoke and whispered judgment. The kind of atmosphere that could either crown a dream or quietly bury it forever. Hundreds of well-dressed guests filled the seats. Casino executives, celebrities, wealthy tourists. Critics all murmuring with the bored confidence of people who believed they had already seen everything worth seeing. They had come for Dean Martin. His name alone sold out rooms. His voice, his charm, his effortless command of a stage had become legend. But before Dean's headline performance, there was an opening act few cared about. And that was where the cruelty of the night would begin. Backstage. A young performer stood alone in the narrow corridor between dressing rooms. His name was Elliot Crane. Not famous, not connected, not powerful. Just talented. Painfully talented. He was a pianist and singer who had spent his childhood playing broken keys in a community center, teaching himself music while his mother worked double shifts and his father slowly disappeared into illness. Elliot's suit was borrowed. His shoes were too tight. His hands trembled slightly as he flexed his fingers, not from fear of performing, but from the knowledge that this stage, this single chance might decide whether his life moved forward or folded in on itself. He had been told this opportunity was rare. 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes before Dean Martin. 5 minutes to prove he belonged somewhere he had never been invited before. But even before Elliot reached the stage, the humiliation had already started. 2 production assistants whispered as he passed, their eyes scanning him the way one might scan a misplaced object. "That's the opener?" one muttered, not quietly enough. "He looks like he wandered in from the bus station." Another laughed under his breath. Elliot pretended not to hear. He always did. He had learned early that dignity sometimes meant swallowing things that should never be swallowed. He took one more breath, placed his hand on the cool wood of the piano bench waiting in the wings, and nodded when the stage manager signaled. The curtain lifted. A soft, indifferent applause trickled through the room, not for him, but for the idea that he would soon be gone and the real show would begin. The spotlight hit him, harsh and white. Elliot walked out, gave a small bow, and sat at the grand piano. For a brief moment, the noise faded. This was his refuge. Black and white keys. Order in a world that had never offered him much. He placed his fingers down and began to play. The opening notes were gentle, thoughtful, a slow, emotional progression that carried more history than most people in that room had patience for. His voice followed, warm, aching, honest. Not flashy, not loud, but real. And that was the problem. A man in the front row leaned back and smirked. Another whispered something to his companion, who snorted into her drink. Someone farther back deliberately coughed, loudly, dramatically. A ripple of restless movement spread. This wasn't what they had paid for. They wanted sparkle, swagger, something safe, something familiar. Elliot was offering them sincerity, and sincerity made bored people uncomfortable. By the second verse, the whispers grew louder. By the chorus, someone actually laughed. Then it happened. A well-known lounge comic, seated near the center aisle, cupped his hands and called out, "Hey kid, is this the funeral or the show?" Laughter exploded. Elliot's fingers faltered for half a second before he forced them back into motion. His heart hammered against his ribs. Heat crawled up his neck. He kept singing. Another voice followed. "Play something people can drink too." More laughter. Louder. Crueler. The stage manager glanced nervously toward the wings. A casino executive shook his head and gestured in a cutting motion. "Wrap it up," but Elliot didn't stop. He couldn't. Because stopping would mean confirming what they were saying, that he didn't belong, that he was an embarrassment, that his years of struggle were nothing more than a private fantasy. He finished the song to scattered claps and open ridicule. One man actually stood to leave. Elliot rose from the bench and gave another small bow, his ears ringing, his chest tight. He had known rejection. He had known empty rooms. But this was different. This was public, surgical, a room full of powerful people deciding together that he was small as he turned to walk off stage. Someone shouted, "Don't quit your day job!" The word sliced through him. Backstage, he barely made it behind the curtain before his composure cracked. He didn't cry. He didn't break down. He simply stood there, staring at the wall, as if his spirit had stepped a few feet outside his body and didn't know how to return. A production assistant rushed past him without looking. Another brushed his shoulder and muttered, "Tough crowd." No apology. No kindness. Just dismissal. That should have been the end of it. That was how these stories usually went. But someone had been watching from the side of the stage. Someone who knew humiliation. Someone who had once been told he wasn't handsome enough, serious enough, talented enough. Someone who had built an entire career on making pain look like charm. Dean Martin. Dean hadn't been in his dressing room. He hadn't been sipping a drink or rehearsing lines. He had been standing just out of sight, listening, watching the room turn cold. Watching a young man continue to sing while being slowly dismantled by strangers. And something in Dean's expression had changed. Not anger, not drama. Something deeper, recognition. Dean stepped forward. Just as Elliot reached the hallway, a single hand touched Elliot's shoulder. "Son," Dean said quietly, "where are you going?" Elliot turned, startled. When he saw who it was, his breath caught. Dean Martin didn't look like a legend up close. He looked like a man. Calm eyes, a serious mouth. A presence that didn't need noise to command space. I'm done, sir," Elliot replied. "They didn't want me." Dean studied him for a long moment, then glanced past him toward the stage where the audience was already settling, already forgetting. "Well," Dean said softly. "That's interesting," Elliot frowned. "What is?" Dean's voice lowered. "Because I want them to hear you." And with that, Dean Martin turned back toward the spotlight, not to begin his own show, but to change the direction of someone else's life. The audience didn't know it yet, but the night they came to be entertained was about to become the night they were taught something instead. The orchestra had already taken their positions. The curtain was halfway closed again. The host's voice echoed faintly through the showroom speakers, warming the crowd up for the appearance they had actually paid to see. Laughter bubbled across the tables. Glasses clinked. The brief, uncomfortable interruption of the unknown opening act was already dissolving into memory. Just another disposable moment in a city built on forgetting. The audience had returned to what they understood: anticipation for a legend, for charm, for familiarity. No one noticed the young man standing frozen in the shadows of the wings, his borrowed jacket still on, his hands slowly curling into fists as he tried to regain control of a night that had slipped through his fingers. Elliot did not hear the host announce Dean Martin's name. He only heard Dean's voice behind him. Steady, unhurried, close enough to cut through the noise without raising its volume. "Stay right here." Elliot turned, confusion mixing with embarrassment. "Mr. Martin, you don't have to." Dean lifted a finger, not commanding, but certain. "I said stay." Then Dean Martin stepped forward. The curtain drew back, and the room erupted. Applause burst from every direction, reflexive and thunderous. Some people stood instantly, napkins dropping from their laps, smiles blooming on faces that moments earlier had twisted with ridicule. The band struck the opening flourish they had rehearsed 100 times. The spotlight found Dean, and he accepted it the way gravity accepts falling things effortlessly, without strain. He waved once, casually, letting the noise swell, letting them have the pleasure of their own excitement. But he did not move toward the microphone. The applause began to thin. Puzzled, Dean raised his hand gently, not to play the crowd, but to quiet it. When the room finally settled, his voice carried through the hall. Warm but unfamiliar in tone, not playful, not teasing. "Not yet performing before we start," he said. "I want to talk about something." That alone caused a ripple. Dean Martin did not talk about something. Dean Martin sang. He joked. He charmed. He slid through evenings like silk. A conversation was not part of the contract. Dean looked out over the sea of faces, letting his eyes move slowly, deliberately, from table to table, front row to balcony, as though he were memorizing them, as though he wanted each person to feel individually seen. A few minutes ago, he continued, most of you were introduced to a young man. Some shifted in their seats. A few frowned. Others smiled uncertainly. He sat right there. Dean gestured toward the piano. He played you a song. A couple of people clapped weakly, not knowing why they were clapping. Dean's gaze sharpened slightly. And while he was playing, he said, some of you laughed. A cough sounded. Someone adjusted their chair. Some of you talked over him. Some of you mocked him. Some of you decided he wasn't worth your attention before he'd even finished his first verse. The room had gone very still now. Dean let that silence stretch. He did not rush to fill it. He understood its power. He had lived his life on stages. He knew that sometimes silence could say what music could not. Then he did something no one expected. He turned away from the audience. Dean. Martin walked off the stage. A confused murmur swept the showroom. The band faltered, unsure whether to continue playing. The host peeked from the wings, pale and rigid, clearly trying to calculate how quickly his career could be ended. Dean did not go to his dressing room. He went to Elliot. The young man looked up, just in time to see Dean approaching. For a moment, panic seized him. He thought perhaps he had misunderstood that this was going to be a quiet dismissal, a polite thank you, a professional apology that changed nothing. He straightened instinctively, smoothing his jacket. Dean stopped in front of him. Do you still remember the song you were playing? Dean asked. Elliot swallowed. Yes, sir. Good, Dean replied. Because you didn't finish. Before Elliot could speak, Dean turned and gestured toward the stage. Come with me. Elliot's feet did not move. Every instinct told him not to go back out there. Not into that light. Not into that room of smiling mouths and careless hands. He had survived their laughter once. He was not sure he could survive it again. Dean seemed to read that hesitation. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice so only Elliot could hear. They didn't humiliate you, he said quietly. They exposed themselves. Don't let them write the ending. Yes. Then, without waiting, Dean stepped back toward the stage, and this time, he did not go alone. He walked beside Elliot. The curtain opened again. Confusion rippled across the audience like a nervous wind. Some people leaned forward. Others laughed uncertainly, assuming this was part of the act. Cameras shifted. The band fell silent. Dean Martin returned to the spotlight, and with him, to the visible shock of the entire room, came the young man they had just dismissed. Dean guided Elliot to the piano, pulled the bench back himself, and gestured for him to sit. Then, Dean did something that drained the room of breath. He took a second microphone. I want you to listen. Dean said, no joke, no smile, no music, just a sentence. Elliot sat. His hands hovered over the keys, shaking now in a way he could not control. His throat felt too tight to speak, too tight to breathe. He looked out at the crowd, and for the first time, they were looking back. Not with boredom, not with humor. With uncertainty, Dean placed a hand on Elliot's shoulder. Take your time, he said. The spotlight narrowed. No longer on Dean, but on the young man seated at the piano, and in that moment, Elliot understood something he had never understood before. He was not being rescued. He was being trusted. He closed his eyes. He began again. The opening notes were different. This time, slower, lower, as if they were rising from somewhere. Beneath the floor, somewhere private, the melody unfolded not as a performance, but as a confession. Elliot's voice followed, rougher than before, carrying the weight of what had just happened. Threading it into every word, the room changed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but undeniably. A fork paused halfway to a mouth. A woman's smile faded into something thoughtful. A man who had laughed earlier felt a strange heat in his face and didn't know why. Conversations died. Glasses stopped clinking. Chairs stopped shifting. The song was the same, but the silence around it was not. Elliot sang about standing in doorways where he wasn't invited, about playing rooms that never listened, about giving people pieces of himself they didn't even realize they were stepping on. His voice trembled once, then steadied. His fingers moved with a confidence born not of safety, but of surrender, and something remarkable began to happen. People leaned forward, not because they were supposed to, because they wanted to. Dean stood just behind him, hands loosely clasped, his eyes never leaving Elliot, not as a supervisor, not as a star, but as a witness. He did not sing, he did not interrupt. He let the moment belong entirely to the young man who had almost been erased. When the final note faded, it did not dissolve into noise. It remained hanging, breathing for a heartbeat, then another, and then the room rose, not in polite applause, not in obligation, but in a standing wave of sound that crashed against the stage. Not as celebration, but as acknowledgement. People clapped with their hands above their heads. Some shouted. Some simply stared. A woman near the aisle pressed her fingers to her lips, eyes wet. Surprised by herself, Elliot did not stand. He sat there, stunned, as if the world had tilted slightly and he was waiting for it to correct itself. Dean leaned into the microphone. "Now," he said quietly, "we can begin." But the night was no longer his, and somewhere in the crowd, among the very people who had laughed, something else had begun, something far less comfortable than entertainment, something like reflection. The story no one knew the applause did not end quickly. It lingered, rolling through the showroom in uneven waves, as though the room itself were trying to understand what it had just done, what it had just witnessed, and who it had just been moments away from discarding. Elliot remained seated at the piano long after the final note had faded, his hands resting lightly on the keys, his shoulders rising and falling as he tried to slow a breath that refused to become steady. From the stage, the audience looked different now, not like a faceless wall of judgment, but like hundreds of separate expressions, each one caught somewhere between surprise and self-recognition. The laughter from earlier felt impossible in the presence of this silence, as though it had belonged to another night entirely. Dean did not speak immediately. He did not step forward to reclaim the spotlight. He let the applause complete its arc. Let it soften. Let it quiet itself into something closer to respect than excitement. Only then did he place a hand gently on Elliot's shoulder, not to move him, but to ground him. When Elliot finally stood, it was not to bow, but simply because he realized he was no longer afraid of falling. Dean guided him a few steps forward, closer to the microphone. The band remained still. No cue cards. No music. No plan anyone could see. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dean said, his voice calmer now, deeper. "This young man didn't come here tonight to be brave. He came here to work." A soft murmur moved through the room, and when he started to work, Dean continued, "Some of you decided his work wasn't worth your time. That happens. It happened to me. It happened to every person who ever stood on a stage before they were allowed to belong on one." Dean turned slightly toward Elliot. "What they don't know," he said, "is why you sing like that." The sentence landed like a quiet challenge. Elliot looked at him, startled. "Mr. Martin." Dean shook his head gently. "Not for me." For them, the spotlight, which until now had been wide, softened, and narrowed, centering both of them. Elliot's heart pounded. This was not part of anything he had prepared. He had come to sing, not to speak. Not to open the sealed rooms of his life. He looked out into the audience again. And for the first time, he did not see critics or executives or wealthy strangers. He saw people. He saw age. He saw youth. He saw weariness. He saw couples leaning closer together, strangers sitting forward with their hands clasped. Elliot swallowed. "I sing like that," he began, and his voice surprised him with its steadiness, because for a long time, it was the only place anyone listened to me. The room leaned. My father used to work maintenance in a hospital. Night shifts. Quiet floors. He'd take me with him sometimes when my mother couldn't find anyone to watch me. I'd sit in empty waiting rooms and play on broken pianos no one bothered to throw away. Most of the keys didn't work. But the ones that did, they stayed. They didn't leave. They didn't interrupt. They didn't laugh. A hush spread, not forced, not instructed. When my father got sick, Elliot continued, we spent a lot of nights in those same waiting rooms. Only this time, the piano was the only thing that talked back. His hands tightened together briefly, then loosened again. He couldn't speak much near the end, but he could hear. So I played. I played the things I couldn't say. I played the things he was scared to hear. And sometimes when I got it right, he'd squeeze my hand. Somewhere near the middle of the room, a woman slowly raised her napkin to her mouth. That's when I understood something, Elliot said. Music wasn't there to impress people. It was there to sit with them, to stay when nothing else knew how. Dean watched him, his expression unreadable, but his eyes fixed and unblinking. So when I sing, Elliot finished quietly, I'm not trying to entertain anyone. I'm trying not to abandon someone. Silence followed, not the kind of silence that waits for applause, the kind that absorbs. Dean stepped forward. Just slightly, thank you, he said. Then he turned back to the audience. You see, Dean said, talent is easy to judge. You clap, you don't clap. You like it, you don't. But courage is harder. Courage walks into rooms that haven't decided if you're allowed to exist yet. Courage sits at pianos with missing keys and keeps playing anyway. Courage sings to people who can't answer back and trusts that somehow it still matters. It paused, and tonight. Courage walked out here before I did. Dean gestured toward the band. They did not start swinging. They did not launch into anything familiar. The pianist lowered his hands and began something slow. Subtle, almost reverent. Dean turned to Elliot. Do you know that's Amor? He asked softly. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the crowd. Yes, sir, Elliot replied. Good, Dean said. Then don't play it the way I do. A confusion flickered across Elliot's face. Play it the way you hear it. Elliot hesitated only a moment before placing his hands back on the keys. He began carefully reshaping the familiar melody into something gentler, less playful, more reflective. Dean listened for several measures before joining in. Not with his usual easy swagger, but with a restrained, an almost tender version of his voice. Matching Elliot's pace instead of imposing his own, something extraordinary happened. The song people had heard 1,000 times became something else entirely. A conversation. BRIDGEA, shared space. There. Voices wove together youth and experience. Fragility and steadiness, not competing. Not performing at each other, but leaning. When the final harmony faded, the room erupted again. This time without confusion, without nervousness, without distance. They were no longer applauding Dean Martin. They were applauding a moment. But the real transformation of the night did not happen on stage. It happened afterward. Backstage. Long after the curtain closed, the noise still filtering through the walls, Elliot sat alone again. This time on a narrow couch outside Dean's dressing room. He stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. He felt emptied, and full, and frightened, and strangely calm. The door opened. Dean stepped out. No jacket now, sleeves rolled, a glass of water in his hand. He offered it without speaking. Elliot took it. They stood there for a moment. Two silhouettes in the hallways, dim light. You did something dangerous out there, Dean said finally. Elliot looked up. I did? Dean nodded. You reminded people of themselves. Elliot let out a quiet breath. I didn't mean to. Dean's mouth curved into something not quite a smile. Nobody ever does. Then Dean's expression shifted, growing more serious. Do you know what happens next? He asked. Elliot hesitated. I go home. Dean shook his head. Now, he said, people will want you to become something else. Elliot frowned. They'll want you louder, brighter, easier. They'll want the part of you that fits between drinks and applause, and they will offer you things to trade for it. Dean stepped a little closer. "Tonight doesn't protect you," he said. "It exposes you." Elliot felt a chill trace his spine. Dean placed a hand briefly over Elliot's heart. "So you need to decide," he said quietly. "What part of you is not for sale?" And with that, Dean opened the door to his dressing room. "Come in," he said. "There's something I want to show you." Elliot rose and followed, not knowing that behind that door was not comfort, but the beginning of the hardest choice of his life. When the spotlight becomes a mirror, Dean Martin's dressing room did not look like the kind of place where legends were made. There were no gold records mounted on the walls, no dramatic lighting, no sense of spectacle. It was almost modest. A mirror framed with warm bulbs, a coat draped over the back of a chair, a small table with a glass of water, a folded handkerchief, and a single black and white photograph turned face down. The air smelled faintly of aftershave and old wood. For Elliot, who had grown up imagining fame as something glittering and unreachable, the room felt strangely human, like a place someone waited, not a place someone conquered. Dean closed the door behind them, muting the distant applause still echoing through the building. The silence inside was different from the silence on stage. It was not shared. It was private. Elliot shifted his weight, suddenly aware again of his borrowed jacket, his scuffed shoes, the way his life had always felt slightly out of place inside. Larger rooms. Dean walked to the small table and picked up the photograph. He did not hand it to Elliot immediately. He studied it first, as though checking whether it still knew who he was. "You talked about your father," Dean said quietly. "I had one too." He turned the photo around. It showed a much younger Dean Martin standing beside an older man in a simple work shirt. Both of them unsmiling, both of them looking directly into the camera, with an expression that wasn't quite hardness, not quite gentleness, but something forged between. "He worked steel," Dean continued. "Long days, loud days. He wanted me to be a boxer, or a mechanic, something solid, something that didn't vanish when the lights went out." Dean placed the photograph back on the table. "When I told him I wanted to sing," he said, "he didn't come to my first show, or my second, or my 10th. Elliot listened without moving. By the time he finally sat in the audience, Dean went on, "I wasn't singing for him anymore. I was singing to survive a world that had already taught me how quickly applause disappears." Dean met Elliot's eyes. "And that's why I stopped the show tonight." Elliot's chest tightened. "Because of what they did?" Dean shook his head. "Because of what they almost made you do." Elliot frowned. "I don't understand." Dean leaned back against the table, folding his arms. "When they laughed," he said, "I saw you almost shrink. Not physically. Inside, I've seen that look. It's the moment a person starts editing themselves for strangers. The moment they decide to become what gets accepted instead of what is true." Dean paused. "That moment ruins more artists than failure ever could." The room seemed smaller now, as though the walls had inched closer. "Out there," Dean said, gesturing vaguely toward the stage, "you were given something very rare. Not applause, permission, and permission is dangerous. Because once people tell you they like something, they also start telling you what to change." A soft knock touched the door. Dean didn't answer. Another knock, firmer. "Mr. Martin." A voice called from the other side. "There are some people who would really like a word. Executives. Sponsors. There. Asking about the kid?" Dean closed his eyes. Briefly, "Tell them I'll be out in a moment," he said. The footsteps retreated. Dean turned back to Elliot. "They already want you," he said. "Not you as you are. You as you can be shaped." Elliot's pulse quickened. Isn't that how it works?" Dean studied him. "That's how it breaks," he replied. Dean reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folded piece of paper. He smoothed it carefully before placing it on the table between them. "This is a contract," he said. "A development deal. My name opens doors. I could make one call, and you could be playing rooms 10 times this size within months." Elliot's breath caught, and this Dean continued. Placing a second paper beside it is something else. Elliot glanced down. It was handwritten, a list of dates, community centers, veterans, hospitals, small theaters, places. Elliot recognized because he had lived in their edges. They're benefit nights, Dean said. Quiet rooms. Forgotten rooms. The kind that don't make headlines. I help run them when I'm not touring. We don't sell much. We don't impress anyone. But people leave lighter than they came in. Dean looked at him. You can sign the first one, he said, or you can walk into the second. Elliot stared at the papers. The contract represented escape, stability, proof. It was everything he had thought he was climbing toward. The other pages represented uncertainty, obscurity, a return to rooms that did not promise survival. Why are you showing me this? Elliot asked quietly. Dean's answer came without hesitation, because tonight, he said, you showed me something that can't be taught. Elliot felt something unsteady open in his chest. I don't know how to choose, Dean nodded. That's because you're not supposed to choose with your head. Dean reached out and gently tapped Elliot's sternum. You choose with this, and you live with it here. Silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. Elliot thought of his father's hand squeezing his, of broken pianos, of rooms that did not listen but still stayed. He thought of the laughter and of how close he had come to reshaping himself into something safer. Slowly, he slid the contract away. He lifted the handwritten pages. Instead, Dean did not smile, but something in his posture softened, as though a tension he had carried quietly had finally been allowed to rest. A third knock came at the door. Mr. Martin. They're insisting. Dean turned toward it. Give us one more. Minute, the hallway quieted again. Dean picked up a pen and wrote a name at the bottom of the handwritten list. Then he handed it to Elliot. Now he said, you don't walk into those rooms alone. Elliot's voice barely held. Why are you doing this? Dean considered the question, because one night he said, someone did something like this for me, and it took me years to understand what he had actually protected. Dean. Opened the door. Noise rushed in. Faces waited. Opportunities hovered. Dean placed a hand on Elliot's back and guided him forward, but this time, not toward the spotlight, toward the world beyond it, toward rooms where applause was not the point, toward stages where dignity was not earned, but practiced. And as they disappeared into the hallway, the showroom behind them buzzed with speculation, with deals, with stories that would be told and reshaped and sold, but somewhere far from the lights, in places that never made the papers. A different kind of audience would soon be listening, not to a legend, but to a young man who had almost been silenced, and to the quiet standard. A legend had refused to let him lose.